On a day in February, AD 638, Caliph Omar entered Jerusalem atop a white camel. His garments were tattered and dirty, and the soldiers accompanying him were rugged in appearance. Yet their discipline was flawless. Walking beside him was Patriarch Sophronius, the chief magistrate of the newly surrendered city. Omar made his way directly to the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, the very place from which the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended into heaven. As Sophronius observed him standing there, he recalled the words of Christ and whispered through tears, "Behold the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Afterward, the Caliph requested to visit the Christian holy sites. The Patriarch led him to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and guided him through its sacred spaces. While they were still inside, the time for Muslim prayer approached. Omar asked where he might lay down his prayer rug. Sophronius urged him to remain where he stood, but Omar chose instead to step out onto the porch of the Martyrion. He explained that he feared his devout followers might later lay claim to any place in which he had prayed. His caution proved justified. This arrangement followed the conditions set for Jerusalem's surrender. The Prophet Muhammad had declared that while pagans must choose between conversion and death, the people of the book were permitted to maintain their places of worship and practice their faith freely. However, they were not allowed to build new houses of worship, bear arms, or ride horses. They also had to pay a special head tax, the jizya. Sophronius had likely hoped for no better outcome when he ventured out on a donkey under a guarantee of safe conduct to meet Omar on the Mount of Olives, refusing to surrender the city to anyone of lesser rank. Jerusalem had endured a siege lasting over a year. The Arabs, untrained in siege tactics and lacking proper equipment, had failed to breach the city's newly restored defenses. But inside the walls, supplies were dwindling, and no help was expected. The surrounding lands were under Arab control, and town after town in Syria and Palestine had already capitulated. No Christian army remained within reach except the garrison at Caesarea, which held on with the aid of the imperial fleet. Beyond the usual surrender terms, Sophronius secured only a promise that imperial officials in the city could leave safely with their families and belongings, retreating to the coast at Caesarea. This marked the final public act of the Patriarch. From his youth, traveling among Eastern monasteries with his companion John Moscus to collect the sayings and stories of the saints for the spiritual meadow, to his reluctant acceptance of the bishopric of Jerusalem under an emperor whose policies he opposed, Sophronius remained a tireless opponent of heresy and divisive nationalism. He had strived to prevent the fragmentation of the empire. Yet, despite being known as the honey-tongued defender of the faith, his efforts ultimately failed. The Arab conquest was a bitter confirmation of this defeat. A few short weeks later, Sophronius died, his heart broken. No human intervention could have prevented the unrest that erupted in Rome's eastern provinces. A long-standing, underlying tension between East and West had marked the history of the Roman Empire. Although the West triumphed at Actium, it was the East that eventually gained the upper hand over its victors. Provinces like Egypt and Syria stood out as the wealthiest and most densely populated in the empire. They were the empire's industrial heartlands, their ships and trade, caravans managing the flow of goods from the East. Their level of cultural development surpassed that of the West, not only because of their ancient traditions, but also due to the cultural stimulation provided by their proximity to Rome's only true rival in civilization, the Sassanid Persian Empire. As time passed, the East's influence continued to rise. Eventually, Emperor Constantine the Great embraced an Eastern religion and relocated the imperial capital to Byzantium on the Bosphorus. In the following century, when internal decay left the empire vulnerable to barbarian invasions, the West collapsed, but the East endured. As new barbarian kingdoms emerged across Gaul, Spain, Africa, remote Britain, and ultimately Italy, the Roman emperor continued to govern the East from Constantinople. Historically, the Roman administration had rarely been popular in Egypt and Syria. However, resentment toward the government in Constantinople grew even more intense. Much of this animosity stemmed from external factors. The economic decline of the West meant fewer markets for Syrian traders and Egyptian artisans. Ongoing wars with Persia disrupted the desert trade routes linking Antioch to the cities of Lebanon. Soon after, the collapse of the Abyssinian kingdom and turmoil in Arabia severed Red Sea trade routes once dominated by Egyptian sailors and caravan leaders from Petra, Transjordan, and southern Palestine. As Constantinople rose to become the empire's chief commercial hub, long-distance trade, encouraged by imperial diplomacy, shifted toward a more northerly path through the steppes of Central Asia. This shift was deeply resented by the merchants of Alexandria and Antioch, who felt increasingly overshadowed by the imperial capital. Their bitterness deepened as the government moved toward greater centralization. Local rights and freedoms were steadily reduced, while tax collection became more aggressive and burdensome than it had been under earlier Roman rule. This climate of discontent reignited Eastern nationalism, a force that never remained dormant for long. Religious conflict eventually brought this simmering struggle into the open. Under pagan emperors, local religious traditions were often tolerated. It was easy to incorporate regional deities into the Roman pantheon. Only the unwavering monotheism of Jews and Christians occasionally provoked persecution. However, Christian emperors could not afford such tolerance. Christianity, by nature, demands exclusivity, and the emperors saw it as a tool to unify their diverse subjects under a single spiritual and political order. Although Constantine was not deeply versed in theological matters, he tried to unify the church during a time when it was divided by the Arian controversy. 50 years later, Emperor Theodosius the Great went further, making religious conformity a cornerstone of imperial policy. But unity was elusive. The East embraced Christianity with great enthusiasm. Greek intellectual traditions brought a love of intricate theological debate, while Hellenized Easterners added a passionate fervor that often turned into intolerance and fanaticism. The central issue in these disputes was the nature of Christ. While theological in nature, these arguments captivated the general public, who treated religious debate as a favorite pastime, second only to the spectacles of the circus. There were deeper social tensions at play as well. Many ordinary Syrians and Egyptians preferred a simpler form of worship and were repelled by the elaborate ceremonies of the Orthodox Church, which they viewed as excessive, especially in light of their growing poverty. Furthermore, they saw the Orthodox clergy as representatives of the imperial authority in Constantinople. Even among the upper clergy, resentment festered. The patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch were outraged to see the relatively new bishop of Constantinople elevated above them in rank. Given this volatile mix of cultural resentment, economic hardship, centralized oppression, and ecclesiastical rivalry, it was perhaps inevitable that religious dissent would arise. And when it did, it took on the character of a nationalist and divisive movement. Arianism quickly faded in the East, surviving only in Abyssinia, but the theological disputes of the 5th century proved to be far more enduring. Early in that century, Nestorius, a Syrian-born patriarch of Constantinople, introduced a doctrine that placed excessive emphasis on the human nature of Christ. This line of thinking had long been favored by theologians of the Antiochene school, and Nestorius gained considerable support in northern Syria. However, his views were officially condemned as heresy at the Council of Ephesus in 431. As a result, numerous congregations in Syria broke away from the church. Outlawed within the Roman Empire, the Nestorians relocated their base to Mesopotamia, within the domain of the Persian king. From there, they focused their efforts on missionary work further east, reaching as far as India, Turkestan, and even China. Yet during the 6th and 7th centuries, they continued to maintain a presence in Syria and Egypt, primarily among merchants involved in Easter trade. The controversy surrounding Nestorianism eventually led to an even more divisive conflict. Triumphant over both the Antiochene theology and a rival patriarch of Constantinople, the theologians of Alexandria swung too far in the opposite direction. They advanced a doctrine that appeared to negate Christ's humanity altogether. This belief, initially proposed by a relatively obscure priest named Eutyches, came to be known as Monophysitism. In 451, it was condemned by the Council of Chalcedon, the fourth of the ecumenical councils. In response, the Monophysites severed ties with the main body of the Christian Church. Most Egyptian Christians and a significant number of Syrian congregations sided with the Monophysites. The Armenian Church, whose representatives arrived too late to participate in the council's discussions, also rejected the council's decisions and aligned themselves with the Monophysite cause. Subsequent emperors made repeated efforts to heal the rift, seeking a theological formula that could reconcile the divisions and receive the endorsement of another ecumenical council. However, two major obstacles stood in their way. First, the dissenters were not eager to rejoin the Church unless it was on terms that Orthodox leaders found unacceptable. Second, the Roman Church, led by the Pope, strongly opposed any compromise. Pope Leo I, believing it was the duty of the Bishop of Rome to define doctrine, dismissed the intricate theological debates that he struggled to grasp. He issued a straightforward and definitive declaration of orthodoxy, known as the Tome of Leo. Although the document did not address the complexities of the controversy, the Council of Chalcedon adopted it as the foundation for its conclusions. Pope Leo's position was simple and inflexible, leaving no room for nuanced interpretation. Any concession to the dissenters would have required rejecting the Pope's formula, thereby causing a break with Rome. For emperors with political ambitions in Italy or the Western world, such a schism was unacceptable. Trapped in this difficult position, the imperial administration failed to develop a clear or consistent strategy. Instead, it alternated between suppressing the heretics and attempting to win them over. Meanwhile, heretical movements grew stronger in the eastern provinces, bolstered by the resurgence of local nationalist sentiment among Eastern peoples. In addition to the Nestorians and Monophysites, another group in the East posed continual challenges to imperial authority: the Jewish communities. Jews were present in substantial numbers in many major cities across the region. While they faced legal restrictions and were occasionally subjected to violence or property damage during riots, they responded by exploiting any opportunity to harm the Christian population. With their significant financial resources and vast international connections, they were viewed as a persistent and potentially dangerous threat to the state. During the 6th century, conditions in the eastern provinces deteriorated further. Justinian's military campaigns in the west dragged on, draining resources and proving expensive. These conflicts complicated his religious agenda and brought heavier taxes upon the east, without offering any tangible benefits in return. Syria was particularly hard hit. Along with bearing increased fiscal pressure, it endured a string of devastating Persian raids and a series of catastrophic earthquakes. Amid this turmoil, only the heretical movements seemed to thrive. In Syria, the Monophysite community was galvanized into a strong and organized church by Jacob Berdius of Edessa, with crucial support from Empress Theodora. From that point on, the Syrian Monophysites were commonly referred to as the Jacobites. In Egypt, the Monophysites made up nearly the entire native population. Meanwhile, the Nestorians, who were firmly established beyond the Persian border and expanding rapidly eastward, solidified their influence even within the empire. Outside of Palestine's urban centers, Orthodox Christians became a minority. Derisively called the Melkites, they owed their survival to the strength and authority of the imperial government. In 602, a centurion named Phocas seized control of the imperial throne. His reign was marked by brutality and mismanagement. While Constantinople suffered under his tyrannical rule, the provinces descended into chaos, with civil unrest fueled by the rivalries of urban circus factions and deepening divisions among religious sections. In Antioch, the Jacobite and Nestorian patriarchs openly convened a joint council to coordinate efforts against the Orthodox Church. Phocas retaliated by dispatching a military force that massacred large numbers of heretics, aided enthusiastically by the local Jewish population. However, 2 years later, the Jews themselves revolted and executed the Orthodox Patriarch of the city in a violent uprising. In 610, Phocas was overthrown by Heraclius, a young nobleman of Armenian heritage and the son of Africa's provincial governor. That same year, the Persian king Khosroes II launched a full-scale invasion aimed at dismantling the empire. The ensuing conflict lasted 19 years. For the first 12 years, the empire was forced into a defensive stance. One Persian army swept across Anatolia, while another overran Syria. Antioch was captured in 611, followed by Damascus in 613. In the spring of 614, Persian general Sharbaraz advanced into Palestine, plundering the countryside and setting churches ablaze. The only church spared was the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, due to a mosaic above its entrance that portrayed the Magi in traditional Persian attire. On April 15th, Sharbaraz laid siege to Jerusalem. Although Patriarch Zacharias was ready to surrender the city peacefully to prevent bloodshed, the Christian citizens refused to concede. On May 5th, with the assistance of Jews from within the city, the Persians breached the defenses. What followed was a scene of immense horror. With homes and churches engulfed in flames, Christians were slaughtered indiscriminately. Reports claimed 60,000 were killed, and an additional 35,000 were enslaved. The city's sacred relics, including the true cross and the instruments associated with the Passion, had been concealed but were eventually discovered. They were taken, along with Patriarch Zacharias, and sent east as a tribute to the Christian queen of Persia, Miriam, who was a Nestorian. The destruction inflicted on Jerusalem and its surrounding areas was so extensive that even centuries later, the region had yet to fully recover. 3 years after their conquest of Jerusalem, the Persian forces advanced into Egypt and swiftly secured control within a year. Meanwhile, their northern campaigns brought them all the way to the Bosphorus. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. The involvement of the Jewish population in the city's fall left a lasting mark, with memories of their role remaining bitter and unforgiven. The conflict with Persia increasingly took on the character of a religious war. When Emperor Heraclius finally gained the strength to counterattack in 622, he dedicated himself and his army to God, embarking on a campaign as a Christian warrior against the forces of darkness. Later generations would regard him as a precursor to the Crusaders. Indeed, William of Tyre, in his History of the Crusades written centuries later, included the Persian conflict in his account. In fact, the Old French translation of his work was titled The Book of Heraclius. Heraclius's campaign ultimately proved victorious. After numerous setbacks and moments of despair, he delivered a decisive blow to the Persians at the Battle of Nineveh in December 627. In early 628, King Khosroes was assassinated, and his successor sought peace. Although formal peace was not concluded until the following year, the empire eventually regained its lost territories. In August, Heraclius returned to Constantinople in triumph. The next spring, he traveled south to receive the Holy Cross and ceremoniously returned it to Jerusalem. Interestingly, under Persian rule, Eastern Christians had not suffered greatly. Khosroes, after initially supporting the Jews, had soon turned against them and expelled them from Jerusalem. While his court favored the Nestorians, he maintained an official policy of tolerance toward both the Monophysites and the Orthodox. Their churches were rebuilt and restored, and he even sponsored a council in his capital, Ctesiphon, aimed at reconciling the different Christian sects. However, the restoration of imperial authority soon revealed its bias toward the Orthodox Church. Once the initial joy of liberation faded, Syrians and Egyptians saw little benefit. Heraclius had inherited a bankrupt state and had funded his wars with significant loans from the church. The spoils from Persia were insufficient to repay this debt. As a result, heavy taxation resumed, with local populations once again watching their wealth flow into the hands of the Orthodox hierarchy. Heraclius's religious policies further alienated many. Although he harbored no deep-seated hostility toward Jews, his attitude changed after learning of their involvement in the Persian invasions. Influenced perhaps by an old prophecy about a circumcised people bringing ruin to the empire, he ordered the forced baptism of all Jews within imperial territory. He also urged Western rulers to do the same. While the decree was largely unenforceable, it inspired Christian zealots to commit violent acts against Jewish communities, intensifying Jewish resentment of imperial authority. The emperor then turned his attention to theological reconciliation. Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, himself of Syrian Monophysite origin, developed a doctrine intended to bridge the divide between Monophysites and Orthodox believers. With Heraclius's backing, this new doctrine was promoted across the empire following the end of the Persian War. Despite support from the Patriarch and the cautious endorsement of Pope Honorius, it gained little traction. The Monophysite leadership rejected it outright, and many Orthodox believers, led by spiritual figures such as Maximus the Confessor in Constantinople and Sophronius in the East, also opposed it. Heraclius, driven more by zeal than prudence, attempted to impose the doctrine universally. Aside from imperial courtiers and small groups of Armenians and Lebanese Christians, his efforts found little support. In response to the growing rejection, Heraclius revised the doctrine. His ekthesis, issued in 638, presented the idea of monothelitism, which likewise failed to gain acceptance. This theological episode, unresolved until the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680, only deepened the division and confusion that plagued the Christian communities of the East. In 629, while Heraclius was in Constantinople receiving congratulatory delegations from distant lands like France and India, a letter is said to have reached him from an Arabian tribal leader. This man proclaimed himself as a prophet of God and urged the emperor to embrace his new faith. Similar messages were reportedly sent to the rulers of Persia, Abyssinia, and the governor of Egypt. However, this account is likely legendary. It is doubtful that Heraclius at that time had any real awareness of the momentous changes unfolding across the Arabian Peninsula. At the dawn of the 7th century, Arabia was home to numerous independent and often unruly tribes. The region was steeped in idolatry, with each locality worshipping its own deities. The most revered of all shrines was the Kaaba in Mecca, the leading trading hub. Yet idolatry was already declining. Missionaries representing Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism had been active in the region for some time. Zoroastrian influence had made headway only in areas under Persian political control, particularly in the northeast and later in the south. Jewish communities thrived in many Arabian towns, especially Medina, and had converted a number of Arabs. Christianity had the widest reach. Orthodox Christian communities existed in Sinai and Patria, while the Nestorians, like the Zoroastrians, were mostly found in regions protected by Persia. The Monophysites had established congregations all along the caravan trade routes, extending down into Yemen and Hadramaut. Significant desert-edge tribes, such as the Banu Ghassan and the Banu Taghlib, were entirely Monophysite. Arab merchants, who frequently traveled to cities in Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, had many opportunities to observe the great religions of the neighboring civilizations. Within Arabia itself, there also persisted an ancient tradition of monotheism known as Hanif. At the same time, there was a growing pressure for expansion. The Arabian Peninsula's meager resources, which had become even more strained after the collapse of the Himyarite irrigation systems, could no longer support its growing population. Historically, desert peoples had often spilled over into neighboring fertile lands. It was in this setting that Muhammad's extraordinary leadership emerged. Born in the sacred city of Mecca, he belonged to the prominent Quraysh clan, though his own family was of modest standing. He had traveled widely, gaining exposure to other cultures and religions, and took a particular interest in Monophysite Christianity. However, he struggled to accept the doctrine of the Trinity, favoring instead the pure monotheism found in the Hanif tradition. The faith he developed did not completely reject Christianity, but instead offered a revised and simplified version that his fellow Arabs could more readily embrace. Muhammad's rise as a spiritual leader stemmed from his deep understanding of his people. Though intellectually far ahead of his peers, he shared their mindset, values, and instincts. His remarkable political acumen only enhanced his influence. Thanks to this blend of insight and skill, within a decade, he built an empire from nothing. When the Hijra occurred in 622, his support base was limited to his household and a small group of loyal followers. By the time of his death in 632, he had united Arabia under his rule, and his armies were already moving beyond its borders. The sudden ascent of charismatic leaders is not rare in the East, but their dominance often fades just as quickly. Muhammad, however, established a lasting system, anchored by the Quran. The Quran, believed by Muslims to be the divine word revealed through the Prophet, not only contains spiritual guidance and stories, but also offers a comprehensive framework for daily life, governance, and law. It was straightforward enough to be accepted by Muhammad's contemporaries and flexible enough to guide the vast empire his successors would create. Islam's enduring strength lay in its clarity: one God in heaven, one earthly ruler, and one unifying law, the Quran. Unlike Christianity, which preached peace yet often failed to realize it, Islam made no apologies for its militant approach. Even during the lifetime of the Prophet, Islamic forces had already begun targeting the Roman Empire's provinces, conducting small, largely unsuccessful raids into Palestine. With the rise of Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, a clearer strategy of expansion began to emerge. The Arabian Peninsula was fully brought under control, marked by the removal of Persian influence from Bahrain. An Arab force advanced through Patria along the caravan routes leading to southern Palestine, where they defeated the regional governor, Sergius, near the Dead Sea. They proceeded to capture Gaza after a brief siege. While the local population was treated with leniency, the garrison soldiers became the first Christian victims of the Islamic sword. In 634, Abu Bakr was succeeded by Omar, who carried on the mission of territorial expansion. At the same time, Emperor Heraclius, still residing in northern Syria, began to understand the gravity of the Arab incursions. However, the empire was suffering from a severe shortage of manpower. The wars against Persia had drained its resources, and many military units had been disbanded afterward to reduce costs. The empire was gripped by a widespread sense of fatigue and despair, a common aftermath for both victors and vanquished following a prolonged and bitter conflict. Despite these challenges, Heraclius dispatched his brother Theodore, leading the troops from the Syrian province, to stabilize the situation in Palestine. Theodore confronted the two principal Arab armies at a place called Gabbatha, southwest of Jerusalem, where he was soundly defeated. With southern Palestine secured, the Arabs moved north along the trade route running east of the Jordan River toward Damascus and the Orontes Valley. Cities like Tiberias, Baalbek, and Homs surrendered without resistance, and Damascus fell after a short siege in August 635. Now deeply concerned, Heraclius managed with difficulty to send two additional armies southward. One force, composed of Armenian troops under Prince Vahan and a significant contingent of Christian Arabs, led by a sheikh from the Banu Ghassan, was dispatched alongside another under the command of Theodore Tritherius, composed of a mix of imperial forces. Upon hearing of their advance, the Muslims temporarily withdrew from the Orontes Valley in Damascus, retreating toward the Jordan River. Tritherius engaged the Muslim forces at Jabiya in the Horan region, but was defeated. Nevertheless, he managed to hold a defensive position near the Yarmouk River, just southeast of the Sea of Galilee, awaiting reinforcements from Vahan's army. On August 20th, 636, during a fierce sandstorm, the decisive confrontation unfolded. Although the Christian forces outnumbered their opponents, they were strategically outflanked. In a dramatic turn during the battle, the Ghassanid leader and 12,000 Christian Arab soldiers defected to the Muslim side. Their allegiance to Monophysitism, their deep resentment toward Heraclius, and months of unpaid wages had made betrayal an easy choice. This act of treachery sealed the fate of the conflict. The Muslim forces achieved a resounding victory. Both Tritherius and Vahan fell in battle, along with nearly all their troops. With this defeat, Palestine and Syria were left exposed to the advancing Muslim armies. When news of the devastating battle reached Heraclius in Antioch, he was overwhelmed by despair. He believed that divine punishment had come upon him for marrying his niece, Martina. Lacking both troops and funds to defend the province any further, he performed a solemn prayer service in Antioch's cathedral. Afterwards, he departed by sea for Constantinople, weeping as he left the coast and bidding a sorrowful farewell to Syria. The Arab forces rapidly swept through the region. Heterodox Christian groups offered little to no resistance, and the Jewish communities actively supported the invaders, even guiding them. Only the major cities of Caesarea and Jerusalem, along with the fortresses of Pella and Dara near the Persian frontier, organized any significant defense. In Jerusalem, upon hearing of the Arab victory at Yarmouk, Sophronius repaired the city's fortifications. As the enemy approached Jericho, he gathered the sacred relics of Christ and sent them under cover of night to the coast, bound for Constantinople, determined that they would not fall into Muslim hands once more. Jerusalem endured a siege lasting over a year. Caesarea and Dara held out until 639, though by that time they had become isolated outposts. Antioch, the principal city of the East, had fallen the previous year, and nearly the entire region was now under Muslim control. Meanwhile, the Arabs had brought about the downfall of Rome's ancient rival, Persia. Their victory at the Battle of Qadisiyah in 637 secured their hold on Iraq, and a subsequent triumph at Navan the following year gave them control of the Iranian plateau. Yazdijerd III, the final Sassanid king, fled to Khorasan, where he remained until 651. By then, Arab forces had reached his eastern borders, extending as far as the Oxus River and the mountains of Afghanistan. In December 639, the Muslim general Amr led a force of 4,000 men into Egypt. Since the end of Persian rule, Egypt had suffered from disorganized administration. Its current governor, Patriarch Cyrus of Alexandria, was both politically inept and morally compromised. A convert from Nestorianism, Cyrus was a staunch supporter of the emperor's monothelite doctrine, which he sought to impose on the resistant Copts. His rule was so deeply resented that Amr had little difficulty in finding local collaborators. In early 640, after a 2-month siege, Amr captured the key frontier fortress of Pelusium, where he was reinforced by additional troops from the Caliph. He then advanced to Babylon, Old Cairo, where Roman forces were concentrated. A confrontation at Heliopolis in August 640 forced the Romans to retreat into Babylon's fortified citadel, which held out until April 641. Meanwhile, Arab forces had taken control of Upper Egypt. Following Babylon's fall, Amr moved through the Fayyum, facing no resistance as the governor and garrison fled, and then proceeded toward Alexandria. By that time, Cyrus had been recalled to Constantinople, accused of having negotiated secretly with Amr. After Heraclius's death in February, his widow, Empress Regent Martina, found herself too politically vulnerable to organize a defense of Egypt. Cyrus was sent back with instructions to negotiate peace. In November, he met with Amr at Babylon and signed the treaty surrendering Alexandria. However, the political tides soon shifted. Martina was overthrown, and the new government disavowed both Cyrus and the agreement. Amr had already broken terms by launching campaigns into the Pentapolis and Tripolitania. Despite these complications, it was becoming increasingly clear that Alexandria could not be defended, with the rest of Egypt already under Arab control. The city surrendered in November 642. Yet hope briefly revived in 644 when news arrived that Amr had fallen out of favor and been recalled to Medina. A new imperial army was dispatched by sea from Constantinople, swiftly retaking Alexandria in early 645. The force then advanced toward Fustat, the new city founded by Amr near Babylon. But Amr returned to Egypt, defeating the imperial troops near Fustat. Their commander, the Armenian Manuel, retreated to Alexandria. Disheartened by the complete apathy of the local Christian population, who showed no interest in the Roman effort to reclaim the province, he made no attempt to defend the city and instead sailed back to Constantinople. The Coptic Patriarch Benjamin subsequently handed Alexandria over to Omar. Egypt was permanently lost. By the year 700, Roman control in North Africa had collapsed under Arab conquest. Just over a decade later, they entered Spain. By 717, the Muslim empire stretched from the Pyrenees in the west to central India in the east, and its warriors were already laying siege to the walls of Constantinople.